The floodwaters were rising faster than anyone predicted, swallowing entire neighborhoods in minutes. When retired officer Mike Cross spotted a small figure clinging to a collapsing rooftop in the middle of the deadly current, he knew emergency services would never arrive in time. The boy was holding something against his chest, refusing to let go even as the structure crumbled beneath him. It was a puppy, barely alive, and the child would rather drown than abandon his best friend. With his German Shepherd Shadow, Mike made a decision that would push them all to the absolute edge of survival. What started as a rescue attempt quickly became a fight against impossible odds, where one wrong move meant death for everyone. Please support us by subscribing to the channel. The rain had been falling for 3 days straight, turning the quiet town of Millbrook into a disaster zone. Mike Cross stood at the edge of what used to be Riverside Avenue, watching the brown water surge past with terrifying force. Shadow pressed against his leg, the German Shepherd's ears flat against his head, sensing the danger in every rushing wave. Mike had seen floods before, during his years on the force, but nothing like this. The river had burst its banks in the middle of the night, swallowing entire neighborhoods before anyone had time to evacuate. Emergency services were overwhelmed, stretched thin across the county, and Mike knew that meant people were dying while waiting for help that might never come. He had retired from the police force 2 years ago, disillusioned and exhausted, but old habits died hard. When he heard the emergency broadcast that morning, something inside him couldn't just sit still. He grabbed his gear, loaded Shadow into the truck, and drove toward the disaster instead of away from it. Now, standing in the pouring rain, he wondered if he had made a terrible mistake. The water was rising faster than anyone had predicted. Entire houses had been torn from their foundations, tumbling downstream like toys. The sound was deafening, a constant roar that seemed to come from the earth itself. Shadow suddenly went rigid, his head snapping towards something in the distance. Mike followed his gaze and felt his blood run cold. About 200 yards downstream, barely visible through the rain, was a small house tilted at a sickening angle. Half of it had already collapsed into the flood, but the roof was still intact, and on that roof, clinging to the chimney, was a small figure. A child. Mike pulled out his binoculars with shaking hands, the rain making it nearly impossible to focus. When the image finally cleared, his heart sank. It was a boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old, soaking wet and holding something against his chest. Even from this distance, Mike could see the kid was in bad shape, shivering violently in the cold rain. But what made Mike's stomach twist was what the boy was holding. A puppy. A tiny golden retriever puppy that looked barely old enough to be away from its mother. The kid had wrapped his jacket around the little dog, trying to keep it warm, even though he himself was wearing nothing but a thin t-shirt. Shadow whined, pulling at his leash, wanting to go, wanting to help. Mike's mind raced through scenarios, each one worse than the last. The house was in the middle of the fastest part of the current, surrounded by debris that could crush a rescue boat in seconds. The roof could collapse at any moment. And even if he could somehow reach them, how would he get both the boy and the puppy back to safety? His radio crackled to life. Emergency services reporting they were still 45 minutes out, maybe longer. The nearest rescue boat was dealing with a family trapped on a second floor 3 miles upriver. Mike looked back at the house and knew with absolute certainty that 45 minutes was 45 minutes too long. The way that roof was tilting, the way the water was eating away at what remained of the structure, that boy had maybe 10 minutes before the whole thing went under. Mike made a decision that he knew was probably going to get him killed. He turned and ran back to his truck, Shadow racing beside him. In the bed of the truck, he kept emergency equipment he had never quite been able to throw away after retirement. Rope, a flotation device, a small inflatable raft he had bought on sale years ago and never used. As he pulled the raft out, his hands were steady, even though his mind was screaming that this was insane. He had no backup, no safety team, no proper rescue equipment. Just an old cop, a retired K-9, and a raft that probably had holes in it. But when he looked back at that tiny figure clinging to the chimney, holding that puppy like it was the most precious thing in the world, he knew he didn't have a choice. Shadow watched him with those intelligent amber eyes, and Mike could swear the dog understood exactly what they were about to do. The German shepherd had pulled him through dark moments before, had been his anchor when everything else fell apart. Now they were going into the flood together, and Mike had no idea if either of them would come back out. He inflated the raft with the hand pump, his shoulders burning with effort, rain streaming down his face. The boy was still there, still holding on, but the house had shifted again, tilting further into the current. Time was running out, and Mike hadn't even made it to the water yet. Every second counted, and he was about to bet everything on a plan that had almost no chance of working. Mike dragged the raft toward the water's edge, his boots sinking into the mud with every step. Shadow stayed close, his body tense and ready. The German shepherd had been trained for water rescue back in his K-9 days, but that was in controlled environments, not this churning nightmare of a flood. Still, the dog showed no hesitation, no fear, just absolute focus on the task ahead. The rain was getting worse, coming down in sheets so thick Mike could barely see 20 feet in front of him. He tied one end of his rope to a sturdy tree, the other end to the raft. It was a pathetic excuse for a safety line, but it was all he had. If the current caught them, maybe, just maybe, the rope would hold long enough for them to pull themselves back. He pushed the raft into the water and immediately felt the terrible strength of the current trying to rip it away. Shadow jumped in without hesitation, his weight helping to stabilize the small craft. Mike climbed in after him, nearly capsizing them in the process. The raft spun wildly for a moment before Mike managed to grab the paddle and point them toward the house. The journey across the flood was like trying to navigate through hell. Debris slammed into them from every direction. A wooden fence panel crashed into the side of the raft, nearly flipping them. A propane tank bobbed past, close enough for Mike to read the warning label. Shadow braced himself in the center of the raft, his claws digging into the rubber, his body moving with every lurch and spin to keep them balanced. Mike paddled with everything he had, his arms screaming in protest, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might burst. The house was getting closer, but so was other debris, a massive tangle of trees and metal that was bearing down on them from upstream. If that hit them, they were dead. Simple as that. Shadow barked once, sharp and urgent, his eyes fixed on something Mike couldn't see through the rain. The dog's warning came just in time. A submerged car hood suddenly broke the surface right in front of them, spinning in the current like a blade. Mike jammed the paddle down, pushing them sideways, feeling the metal scrape along the bottom of the raft with a sound that made his teeth ache. They were 50 feet from the house now, close enough that Mike could see the boy's face clearly. The kid was even younger than he had thought, maybe 6 years old, with dark hair plastered to his head and eyes wide with terror. The puppy in his arms wasn't moving anymore. Mike couldn't tell if it was dead or just unconscious, but the way the boy was crying, clutching that little dog to his chest, told him everything he needed to know about how much that puppy meant to the kid. 30 feet. The current was pulling them past the house, trying to drag them downstream. Mike paddled harder, feeling something tear in his shoulder, ignoring the pain. Shadow was barking now, trying to get the boy's attention, trying to let him know help was coming. The boy saw them. His face transformed from despair to desperate hope in an instant. He tried to wave, but he couldn't let go of the chimney without risking sliding off the tilted roof. The puppy slipped slightly in his grip, and the boy made a sound that cut through even the roar of the flood, a cry of pure anguish. 20 feet. Mike could see that the roof was barely attached to the rest of the house anymore. The water had undermined the entire structure, and it was only a matter of time, maybe seconds, before the whole thing collapsed and took the boy with it. Mike had to time this perfectly. Too fast, and they would crash into the debris field surrounding the house. Too slow, and they would miss their chance entirely. Shadow was standing now, his front paws on the edge of the raft, every muscle in his body coiled and ready. Mike knew what the dog was thinking, because he was thinking the same thing. They were going to have to leave the raft, swim through that debris, and somehow get to that roof before it collapsed. 10 feet. Mike saw it happen in slow motion. The rope he had tied to the tree went taut, jerking them backward violently. He had reached the end of his safety line. The house was right there, so close he could almost touch it, but the rope was holding them back. Mike had a split second to make a decision that would determine whether everyone lived or died. He pulled out his knife and cut the rope. The raft immediately shot forward, caught by the current, spinning wildly out of control. Shadow barked in alarm as they hurtled toward the house, toward the debris, toward the boy who was screaming for help as the roof beneath him began to crack and splinter with sounds like gunshots in the rain. The raft slammed into the side of the house with enough force to knock Mike flat. His head cracked against the rubber, stars exploding across his vision. Shadow somehow maintained his balance, already moving, already calculating the jump to the tilted roof where the boy clung to the chimney. Mike forced himself up, shaking off the dizziness, blood trickling down his temple mixing with rain. The raft was wedged against a tangle of debris, held in place by nothing but luck and the chaotic geometry of wreckage. It wouldn't hold for long. Already he could feel it shifting, the current trying to pull them loose. The boy was maybe 8 feet above them, on a section of roof that formed a steep angle. Too steep for Mike to climb safely, especially with the shingles slick from rain. But Shadow was already moving, his powerful legs coiling, and then he jumped. The German shepherd landed on the roof, his claws scrabbling for purchase on the wet surface. For a terrifying moment, he started to slide back, but then his training kicked in, and he found his grip, pulling himself up toward the boy. The child's eyes went wide with fear at the sight of the big dog, but Shadow moved slowly, carefully, his body language non-threatening despite the chaos around them. The dog reached the boy and immediately positioned himself between the kid and the edge of the roof, creating a living barrier to prevent him from sliding into the flood. Mike tried to follow, reaching for the edge of the roof, but the raft chose that moment to break free. The current caught it instantly, and Mike felt himself being pulled away. He grabbed for anything, his fingers closing on a piece of broken gutter that tore free in his hand. He was going into the water, and in this current, wearing these heavy boots and soaked clothes, he would sink like a stone. Shadow saw it happening. The dog made a sound Mike had never heard before, something between a bark and a howl, and then the German shepherd did something that stopped Mike's heart. Shadow grabbed the boy's shirt in his teeth, gently but firmly, and started pulling him up the roof toward the chimney, trying to get him to higher ground, trying to secure him before leaving to help Mike. But the boy didn't understand. He thought the dog was trying to separate him from his puppy. The child screamed and pulled back, and in that moment of resistance, the puppy slipped from his grip. The tiny golden retriever tumbled down the tilted roof, too weak to even cry out, sliding directly toward the edge and the churning water below. The boy lunged after his puppy, breaking free from Shadow's grip. Mike watched in horror as the child lost his footing on the wet shingles, his small body sliding down the angled roof. Shadow moved instantly, faster than Mike thought possible, but the roof was tilting at such a severe angle that the dog couldn't get traction. All three of them, boy, puppy, and German shepherd, were sliding toward the edge. Mike made a decision born of pure instinct. He let go of the house and dove into the water, swimming with powerful strokes toward the point where they would fall. The current was impossibly strong, pulling him under, filling his mouth and nose with muddy water that tasted of diesel and death. His boots felt like anchors, his clothes trying to drag him down, but he fought his way to the surface, his eyes locked on that roof. Shadow went over first, his body hitting the water with a splash that was lost in the roar of the flood. Then the boy, still reaching for his puppy, his scream cut short as he went under. The puppy fell last, a tiny golden shape that disappeared into the brown water without a sound. Mike swam harder than he had ever swam in his life, his arms burning, his lungs screaming for air. He saw Shadow surface first, the German shepherd's head breaking through the water, his powerful legs already working to keep him afloat. The dog's eyes were searching, finding Mike, then sweeping the surface for the boy and puppy. There, the boy's head appeared, gasping and choking, his arms flailing. But he was still trying to reach for something, still not trying to save himself because he was looking for his puppy. Mike reached him in 3 more strokes, grabbing the back of the kid's shirt, pulling his head above water. The boy was coughing, spitting out muddy water, but his first words weren't about himself. They were a desperate cry for his puppy, a name choked out between sobs. Buddy. The puppy's name was Buddy, and the boy was screaming it over and over, trying to pull away from Mike, trying to dive back under to find his dying dog. Shadow was ahead of them, his nose just above the waterline, his head moving back and forth in a search pattern Mike recognized from their years working together. The German shepherd was hunting, using every sense he had to locate the puppy in this impossible maze of debris and flooding water. And then Shadow's head dipped under, completely submerging, and for a terrifying moment, Mike thought he had lost his dog too. But Shadow came back up, and in his mouth, held as gently as a mother carries her own pup, was Buddy. The tiny golden retriever was limp, not moving, but Shadow was swimming toward them with powerful strokes, fighting the current, refusing to let go of the puppy even as debris crashed around them. Mike held the boy with one arm while treading water with the other, fighting to keep both their heads above the surface. The current was relentless, pulling them downstream, away from anything that could save them. The boy was still crying, calling for Buddy, not understanding that Shadow was bringing the puppy to them, not comprehending anything except that his best friend might be dead. Shadow reached them, his amber eyes meeting Mike's with an intensity that communicated everything. The German shepherd was exhausted. Fighting the current was taking everything he had, and they needed to get to shore now, or they would all drown. Mike grabbed Shadow's collar with his free hand, and together they formed a chain. Human, dog, human, puppy, all connected, all fighting the water together. But the current was too strong. Mike's legs were cramping. His arms felt like they were being ripped from their sockets, and he could feel himself starting to go under. The boy was dead weight now, having swallowed too much water, his coughs becoming weaker. Shadow was still swimming, still fighting, but Mike could feel the dog's movements becoming less coordinated, exhaustion setting in. They were going to die. All of them. Mike had failed. He had cut the safety rope. He had made the wrong decision, and now a child, a puppy, and his loyal dog were going to pay the price for his arrogance. The water was winning. It had always been going to win, and Mike felt a terrible sense of peace wash over him as he accepted their fate. Then he heard it, a sound that cut through the roar of the flood, through the rain, through his own despair. A helicopter. Mike forced his head up, water streaming from his face, and saw it through the rain. A news helicopter, low and fast, circling back toward them. Someone had seen them. Someone was calling for help. The boy coughed weakly in his arms, and Mike held him tighter, kicking his legs harder, forcing himself to keep fighting for just a little longer. Shadow sensed the change in Mike's energy and found a second wind, his powerful legs churning the water, the puppy still secure in his gentle mouth. But the helicopter couldn't help them. Mike realized with crushing disappointment. It was a news chopper, not rescue. It didn't have equipment to pull them out. All it could do was watch and film as they drowned. The irony was bitter. They would be on the evening news, Another tragic story of the flood. People would shake their heads and say it was terrible while eating dinner. The current pulled them around a bend, and suddenly Mike saw something that made his heart leap. A bridge, or what was left of one. The flood had torn away most of the structure, but one section of the concrete barrier remained, creating a small island in the churning water. It was downstream, and if they could somehow angle toward it, if they could somehow cross the current instead of being carried by it, they might be able to grab on. Mike knew it was nearly impossible. They were too exhausted, the current too strong. But it was a chance. Maybe their only one, and he was going to take it. He looked at Shadow, and somehow the dog understood. The German shepherd adjusted his swimming angle, fighting sideways across the current instead of just trying to stay afloat. Mike did the same, kicking with legs that screamed in protest, pulling the boy along, trying to reach that bridge section. They were getting closer, 30 feet, 20, but the current was also pulling them past it. It was going to be close, too close. Everything depended on the next 30 seconds. 15 feet. Mike could see the concrete now, covered in slime and debris, but solid, real, something they could hold on to. Shadow was ahead of them, still swimming with everything he had. The puppy's golden fur dark and wet in his mouth. No movement from the tiny dog at all. 10 feet. Mike reached out, his fingertips brushing concrete, but the current ripped him away. He kicked harder, his lungs burning, his vision starting to tunnel. The boy was barely conscious now, his head lolling against Mike's shoulder. This was their last chance. If they missed this, there was nothing else downstream except more water, more death. Shadow hit the concrete first, his claws scraping, finding purchase. The German shepherd pulled himself onto the narrow strip of bridge, immediately turning back, barking at Mike, urging him on. 5 feet. Mike lunged forward with the last of his strength, his hand closing on a piece of rebar sticking out from the broken concrete. He held on with everything he had, the current trying to tear him and the boy away. His shoulder dislocating with a pop, he felt more than heard. But he didn't let go. Through the pain, through the exhaustion, through the voice in his head screaming at him to just give up, Mike Cross held on. Shadow grabbed the back of Mike's jacket in his teeth, adding his strength, pulling with powerful neck muscles trained over years of canine work. Together, inch by agonizing inch, they pulled themselves and the boy out of the current and onto the concrete. Mike collapsed onto the concrete, his body shaking uncontrollably, his dislocated shoulder sending waves of agony through his entire right side. The boy lay beside him, coughing up water, his small chest heaving with each painful breath. Shadow stood over them both, his legs trembling with exhaustion, the puppy still held carefully in his mouth. The German shepherd gently laid Buddy down on the concrete and immediately started licking the tiny dog's face, trying to stimulate a response. The puppy didn't move. His little chest wasn't rising and falling. Shadow whined, a sound of distress Mike had rarely heard from the stoic dog, and continued licking, pawing gently at the puppy, refusing to accept that he might be dead. The boy saw Buddy lying motionless and made a sound that broke Mike's heart. Despite barely being able to breathe himself, despite having just nearly drowned, the child crawled toward his puppy on hands and knees, reaching out with shaking hands. He picked up the little golden retriever, cradling him against his chest, and started crying. Not the panicked tears from before, but something worse. The quiet, hopeless tears of a child who knows he has lost something he can never get back. Mike forced himself to sit up, his right arm hanging useless at his side. He had seen death before, too many times during his years on the force, and he recognized it in the puppy's stillness. But he also knew that drowning victims sometimes could be revived, especially small ones who hadn't been under long. He reached out with his left hand, ignoring the screaming pain from his shoulder. Take him away from the kid, Mike told himself. If you're going to try CPR on a puppy, you can't do it while the boy is watching, because if it doesn't work, if Buddy is really gone, it will destroy him. But when Mike touched the boy's shoulder, trying to gently take the puppy, the child pulled away, holding Buddy tighter, shaking his head violently. The boy's voice was hoarse and broken, but his words were clear enough. No, Buddy was his. They were staying together, no matter what. Mike saw in the child's eyes something he recognized from his own darkest moments. That absolute refusal to let go. That determination to hold on to what you love even when the whole world is trying to take it away. Shadow moved closer, positioning himself next to the boy, and did something that made Mike's throat tighten. The German shepherd very gently nosed the puppy's body, then looked up at Mike with an expression that said everything. Try. We have to try. Even if it seems impossible, even if it seems too late, we have to try. Mike nodded, understanding. He shifted closer to the boy, moving slowly, making sure the kid knew he wasn't trying to take Buddy away. With his one good hand, he showed the boy what to do, how to lay the puppy down flat, how to position his hands to do chest compressions on things so small. The child watched with wide eyes, then carefully laid Buddy on the concrete, his small hands shaking as he positioned them the way Mike showed him. Together, they started CPR. The boy did tiny compressions on the puppy's chest, while Mike, using only his left hand, did the rescue breathing small puffs of air into Buddy's tiny nose and mouth. Shadow watched intently, his tail still, his entire body focused on the puppy. Nothing happened. Mike counted compressions, counted breaths, his mind tracking the seconds that were turning into minutes. The helicopter was still overhead, circling, but it was just watching, just recording, unable to help. The rain continued to pour down, cold and relentless. Mike's shoulder was a white-hot ball of agony, and the boy's hands were turning blue from the cold, but neither of them stopped. 2 minutes. 3. Mike knew the odds, knew that with each passing second, the chances dropped dramatically. But the boy kept doing compressions, his face set in determination that looked wrong on someone so young, and Mike couldn't bring himself to tell the kid to stop, to give up, to accept that Buddy was gone. Shadow suddenly moved, pushing his nose against the puppy's side, whining softly. Mike was about to gently move the dog away when he saw it. The smallest movement, so tiny he thought he had imagined it. Buddy's back leg twitched. Just once barely visible, but it was movement. The boy saw it too, his eyes going wide, hope flooding his face. He pressed his hands down on Buddy's chest again, and Mike gave another rescue breath. And this time, the puppy coughed. A tiny, wet cough that was the most beautiful sound Mike had ever heard. Buddy coughed again, stronger, and then he was breathing on his own, taking shaky, gasping breaths, but breathing. Shadow barked, loud and triumphant, his tail finally starting to wag. The boy picked up Buddy, holding him close, crying again. But these were different tears, tears of relief and joy and disbelief. The puppy was weak, barely able to lift his head, but his little tail was trying to wag, and his pink tongue came out to lick the boy's hand. Mike sat back on the concrete, overwhelmed by a wave of relief so strong it made him dizzy. They had done it. Against impossible odds, they had saved the puppy. But their situation was still desperate. They were stranded on a small piece of destroyed bridge in the middle of a raging flood. Mike had a dislocated shoulder. The boy was hypothermic, and the puppy needed immediate veterinary care. The helicopter was still overhead, and Mike could see the camera pointed at them. At least someone knew where they were, which meant rescue would come eventually. But eventually might be too long. The boy was shivering violently now, his lips blue, his small body going into shock from the cold water and the trauma. Buddy was barely moving in his arms, the brief spark of life flickering weakly. Shadow pressed against the boy, sharing his body heat, trying to warm the shivering child. Mike did the same from the other side, creating a shelter with their bodies despite the rain. He needed to pop his shoulder back in. The pain was making it hard to think. But he couldn't do it himself with only one good arm. And he sure as hell wasn't going to ask the kid to help. The section of bridge they were on was maybe 15 feet long and 8 feet wide. It was covered in debris, pieces of other people's lives torn apart by the flood, a child's bicycle, a family photo in a broken frame, a basketball. Each item a small tragedy, a reminder of how much had been lost today. Mike looked at the photo, a family of 4 smiling at a birthday party, and wondered if they had made it out, if they were alive somewhere, or if they had become part of the flood's body count. The boy suddenly spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. His name was Tyler. He was 6 years old. His mom had gone to get the car, told him to wait by the door with Buddy, but the water came so fast. The house started filling up, and Tyler ran upstairs, climbed onto the roof through a window, holding Buddy the whole time. His mom never came back. He had been on that roof for hours, holding his puppy, waiting for someone to find them. Mike felt his chest tighten. The mom. He hadn't even thought about parents, about family. Tyler was alone, holding on to a puppy because it was the only thing left in his world that he could protect. Mike looked at the rushing water, at all the debris, and knew with sick certainty that Tyler's mother was probably out there somewhere, another victim of the flood's terrible power. But he didn't say that. Instead, he told Tyler he did the right thing, that he was brave, that Buddy was alive because Tyler didn't give up. Shadow nuzzled the boy, and Tyler reached up with one hand to pet the German shepherd, his other arm still wrapped around his puppy. Despite everything, despite the cold and the fear and the loss, the kid managed a small smile as Shadow's gentle attention. The sound of the helicopter changed, growing louder, more urgent. Mike looked up and saw why. The flood was rising again. The section of bridge they were on, which had been barely above water, was now being washed over by waves. In another 10 minutes, maybe less, it would be completely submerged, and they would be back in the water with nowhere to go. Mike's radio crackled in his pocket. He had forgotten he even had it. The thing was waterlogged and dying, but a voice came through, broken and static-filled. Coast Guard. They had a helicopter inbound. 5 minutes out. Hold on for 5 minutes. The transmission cut out, dissolved into static, and the radio died completely. 5 minutes. Mike looked at the rising water, at Tyler's blue lips, at Buddy's barely moving chest, at Shadow's exhausted eyes. 5 minutes might as well be 5 hours. The water was already lapping at their feet, cold and relentless, promising to take them back, to finish what it had started. Shadow stood up, positioning himself at the edge of the concrete, facing downstream. His body language changed, becoming alert and tense. Mike saw what the dog had spotted and felt his blood run cold. A massive tree was coming toward them, roots and all, spinning slowly in the current like a deadly pinwheel. If that hit their section of bridge, it would either destroy what was left or sweep them all back into the water. There was nowhere to go. They couldn't swim. Tyler and Buddy wouldn't survive another minute in that water. They couldn't climb. There was nothing to climb to. All they could do was brace themselves and pray that the tree missed them or that the bridge was stronger than it looked. Mike pulled Tyler closer. Shadow pressed against them both, and they watched the tree come closer, closer, the branches reaching out like grasping fingers. The tree hit with a sound like a cannon. The impact knocked them all flat, water washing over them in a wave. Mike held on to Tyler. Tyler held on to Buddy, and Shadow dug his claws into the concrete, trying to keep them all anchored. The tree scraped along the side of the bridge, branches catching and pulling, and for a terrible moment, Mike felt the concrete shift beneath them, felt it start to break apart. But it held. Somehow, impossibly, it held. The tree scraped past and continued downstream, leaving them shaken but alive. Tyler was crying again, clutching Buddy so tight Mike worried he might hurt the puppy. Shadow shook himself, water flying everywhere, and went back to his position at the edge, still on guard, still protecting them. The water was at their knees now, rising faster than Mike had thought possible. Tyler was standing, holding Buddy above the waterline, his small body swaying with cold and exhaustion. Shadow was beside him, letting the boy lean against him for support. Mike struggled to his feet, his dislocated shoulder making every movement agony, but he forced himself up. If they were going into the water again, he needed to be ready. The sound of the helicopter changed. Not the news helicopter, which was still circling above, but something bigger, heavier. Mike looked up and saw it emerging from the rain like a guardian angel. Coast Guard. The bright orange and white helicopter moved into position above them, fighting the wind and rain, hovering impossibly steady considering the conditions. A figure appeared in the open door of the helicopter. A rescue swimmer, already clipping onto a cable, preparing to descend. Mike felt a surge of relief so powerful, it almost brought him to his knees. They were going to make it. After everything, they were actually going to make it. He looked down at Tyler, at the kid who had refused to give up on his puppy, and saw hope return to those young eyes. The rescue swimmer descended through the rain, spinning slightly on the cable, fighting the wind. He was maybe 20 feet above them when everything went wrong. The helicopter shuddered, caught by a massive gust of wind, and tilted violently. The rescue swimmer swung out over the water, the cable paying out too fast, and then Mike heard the sound he had been dreading. Metal snapping. The cable broke. The rescue swimmer hit the water 50 feet downstream, the current immediately grabbing him, pulling him under. The helicopter pilot fought for control, pulling up and away, emergency lights flashing. Mike watched in horror as the swimmer surfaced once, twice, his arms reaching for something to grab, finding nothing but water. Then he was gone, swept away by the flood, just another victim. Tyler started crying, understanding that their rescue had just drowned trying to save them. Mike felt something break inside him. He had survived wars, years on the force, the darkest moments of his life, but watching that swimmer disappear, knowing the man had died because Mike and Shadow and Tyler and Buddy were stranded here, it was too much. Shadow barked, sharp and insistent, pulling Mike back from the edge of despair. The German shepherd was staring at something upstream, his body rigid with focus. Mike forced himself to look, to pay attention, and saw what Shadow had spotted. A boat, not a rescue boat, just a small fishing boat that had broken free from somewhere upstream, drifting with the current, spinning slowly as it approached their position. It was damaged, listing badly to one side, taking on water. It would sink soon, probably in the next few minutes. But right now, right at this moment, it was floating, and it was coming directly toward them. Mike felt his tactical mind kick in, pushing past the pain and exhaustion and grief. If they could time this right, if they could jump to the boat as it passed, they might be able to ride it far enough downstream to reach calmer water, or at least reach another piece of high ground. But the timing would have to be perfect. The boat was moving fast, carried by the current, and they would have maybe a 2-second window to jump. If they missed, they were back in the water with no energy left to survive. If they jumped too early and Mike's shoulder gave out, they would fall short. If Tyler slipped, if Shadow didn't make the jump, if Buddy fell from the boy's grip, they would lose everything in an instant. Mike looked at Shadow, and the dog looked back, and in that moment, they were back on the force together, working in perfect sync, trusting each other completely. Mike positioned himself behind Tyler, ready to literally throw the boy to the boat if necessary. Shadow moved to the edge, calculating angles and distances with the precision that had made him one of the best K9s in the state. The boat was 50 feet away. 40. Mike could see inside it now, see that it was filling with water faster than he had thought, see that they would have maybe 3 minutes before it sank completely. But 3 minutes was better than nothing. 3 minutes was a chance. 30 feet. Tyler was shaking so hard he could barely stand. Mike put his one good hand on the boy's shoulder, steadying him, telling him to trust, to jump when Mike said jump, to hold Buddy tight, and not let go, no matter what. The kid nodded, his jaw set with determination that looked heartbreaking on someone so young. 20 feet. Shadow was coiled like a spring, every muscle ready. The German shepherd had made harder jumps before, but never when he was this exhausted, never with this much on the line. If Shadow didn't make it, Mike knew he would stay on this bridge and die, because he couldn't leave his dog behind. Not after everything they had been through together. 10 feet. The boat was level with them now, spinning slightly as it came alongside the bridge. Mike could see the name painted on the side, Lucky Lady, and almost laughed at the irony. He tightened his grip on Tyler's shoulder, feeling the boy tense, ready to jump. Now, Mike shouted, his voice cutting through the roar of the flood. Shadow jumped first, a powerful leap that carried him across the gap and into the boat. The German shepherd landed hard, slipped on the wet bottom, but kept his feet. Tyler jumped next, and Mike pushed him, giving the kid the extra momentum he needed. Tyler flew across the gap. Buddy clutched to his chest, and Shadow was there, catching the boy with his body, keeping him from sliding into the water that was already pooling in the bottom of the boat. Mike jumped last, his right arm useless, his left arm reaching out, his legs driving him forward. For a terrible instant, he hung in the air, the gap between the bridge and the boat stretching out forever, and he knew he wasn't going to make it. His exhausted legs hadn't generated enough power. His timing was off. He was going to fall short and hit the water, and that would be the end. Shadow saw it too. The German shepherd moved faster than Mike thought possible, lunging to the side of the boat, his powerful jaws clamping onto Mike's jacket at the last second. Mike felt himself being pulled, felt Shadow's strength keeping him from falling, and then he was crashing into the boat, his shoulders screaming as he landed wrong. But he was in, he was alive. They were all in the boat together. The Lucky Lady spun wildly as the current caught it, tilting dangerously, water sloshing over the sides. Mike forced himself up, looking around frantically for anything they could use. There were oars, but they were broken. There was a life jacket, and Mike immediately grabbed it, strapping it onto Tyler despite the boy's protests. Shadow shook himself, spraying water everywhere, then positioned himself at the highest point of the tilting boat, trying to use his weight to help stabilize it. The boat was sinking. Mike could feel it settling lower in the water, could see the waterline creeping up the sides. They had maybe 2 minutes before it went under completely. He looked around desperately, trying to spot anything they could swim to, any piece of high ground. There was nothing. Just water in every direction, brown and churning and merciless. Tyler was sitting in the bottom of the boat, holding Buddy close to his chest, the puppy wrapped in his shirt, shivering but alive. The kid was beyond exhausted, barely able to keep his eyes open, running on nothing but the need to protect his dog. Shadow moved next to them, adding his warmth, his presence, his absolute refusal to give up. The helicopter was back, circling overhead, but Mike could see they were having trouble with the wind. They couldn't risk another swimmer, not after what happened to the first one. All they could do was watch and film and report their position, hoping that somehow, somewhere, someone would be able to mount a rescue that didn't end in more death. Mike's radio had been in his pocket, and though it was destroyed, it had protected something else. His phone, in a waterproof case he had bought years ago and almost thrown away a dozen times. He pulled it out with shaking hands, praying it still worked. The screen flickered to life, showing 1 bar of signal, 20% battery. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. He called 911, his fingers fumbling on the wet screen. It rang once, twice, 3 times, and Mike started to lose hope. Then a voice answered, professional and calm, asking him to state his emergency. Mike almost laughed. state his emergency. He was in a sinking boat in the middle of a catastrophic flood with a hypothermic child, a dying puppy, and his exhausted canine partner, having just watched a rescue swimmer drown trying to save them. But he didn't say any of that. Instead, he gave their position as best he could, described the boat, described the helicopter overhead that could guide rescue crews to them. The dispatcher's voice changed, became more urgent, telling him to hold on, that they had multiple rescue teams in the area, that someone would reach them soon. Mike wanted to believe it, wanted to trust that help was coming, but he had been let down too many times before. The boat lurched suddenly, the bow dipping under the water. They were going down. Mike grabbed Tyler, pulling him to the highest point of the boat, where Shadow was already waiting. The water was at their ankles, their knees, rising with terrifying speed. The lucky lady was making her final voyage, and she was taking them down with her. Shadow barked, his voice cutting through Mike's rising panic. The dog was staring at something, his ears forward, his tail suddenly wagging. Mike followed his gaze and saw it. A tree. Not floating, but standing, growing from what must be a small hill that was now an island in the flood. The tree was maybe 30 feet away, and it had a thick branch extending out over the water, low enough that they might be able to reach it. The boat was sinking fast, the stern already completely underwater. Mike looked at the tree, calculated the distance, and knew they had one chance. If they could swim to that tree, climb it, they could wait out the flood from relative safety. The water was still rising, but if that tree was rooted in high ground, it should stay above the waterline long enough for rescue to arrive. He explained the plan to Tyler, his voice calm, despite the terror he felt inside. The boy would hold on to Shadow's collar, and Shadow would swim them to the tree. Mike would follow, using his one good arm. Once they reached the tree, Mike would help Tyler climb to the branch, then Shadow, then himself. Simple, except nothing about this was simple, and they were all so exhausted that any of them could go under at any moment. Tyler nodded, understanding, and wrapped one arm around Shadow's collar, keeping his other arm tight around Buddy. The puppy was barely moving now, eyes half closed, breathing in shallow gasps. They were running out of time for him, too. If they didn't get Buddy warm and dry soon, all their efforts to save him would be for nothing. The boat went under with a sucking sound that reminded Mike of a dying breath. They were suddenly in the water again, the current immediately grabbing them, trying to pull them downstream. Shadow started swimming, his powerful legs churning, Tyler holding on desperately. Mike followed, his left arm pulling through the water, his legs kicking, his right shoulder a ball of white-hot agony that made him want to scream. The current was pulling them past the tree, trying to sweep them downstream. Shadow fought against it, angling toward the tree, every stroke a battle against the water's terrible strength. Tyler was crying, his face barely above the waterline, but he held on to Shadow and held on to Buddy, refusing to let go of either. Mike could see they weren't going to make it. Shadow was giving everything he had, but it wasn't enough. They were going to miss the tree by maybe 5 feet, just 5 feet. But in this current, 5 feet might as well be 5 miles. They would go past it, and there was nothing else downstream, just more water, more death. Then Mike made a decision. With his last reserve of strength, he surged forward, past Tyler, as Shadow, directly toward the tree. He reached out with his left hand, his fingers brushing bark, slipping, reaching again. His fingernails dug into the wood, finding purchase, and he held on with everything he had. The current tried to tear him away, his shoulder screaming, his grip starting to fail. Shadow saw what Mike had done and changed direction, swimming directly toward Mike instead of the tree. The German shepherd reached him, and Mike grabbed Shadow's collar with his failing grip. Tyler was still holding the collar on the other side, and suddenly they were a chain again. Mike anchoring them to the tree, Shadow in the middle, Tyler at the end, all of them connected, all of them holding on. Mike pulled. His shoulder dislocated further. Something tore in his back. His vision went white with pain, but he pulled. Shadow helped, his powerful legs finding the submerged roots of the tree, pushing. Together, inch by impossible inch, they fought the current and won. Tyler's hand touched the tree, grabbed hold. Shadow pulled himself up onto the roots. Mike let go and nearly went under, but Shadow was there, grabbing his jacket again, pulling him in. They collapsed against the tree, gasping, shaking, barely conscious. But they were out of the water. They were on solid ground, or as solid as anything could be in this nightmare. The tree stretched above them, thick and strong, its branches offering shelter from the worst of the rain. Mike looked up at that branch, the one they needed to reach, and wondered if he had anything left. He did, because he had to. Because Tyler was looking at him with exhausted, trusting eyes, holding a dying puppy, waiting for Mike to tell him what to do next. Because Shadow was still standing, still alert, still ready to help, despite having given everything he had. Because sometimes you find strength you didn't know you had when animals, are depending on you. Mike stood, using the tree for support. He made a step with his hands, or tried to with one hand, and boosted Tyler up. The kid grabbed the branch, pulled himself up with surprising strength, but he still clutched to his chest. Shadow jumped next, his claws scraping on bark, his powerful legs driving him upward until he was on the branch next to Tyler. Mike's turn. He looked at the branch, at his useless right arm, at his exhausted body, and knew this was going to be the hardest thing he had ever done. He jumped, his left hand catching the branch, his legs swinging up, missing, swinging again. He was slipping, his grip failing, about to fall back into the water. Then Shadow was there, grabbing his jacket again, pulling with all the strength left in his powerful neck. Tyler grabbed Mike's left wrist with his small hands, pulling too, adding his weight. Together, they pulled Mike up onto the branch. He wrapped his legs around it, holding on, breathing hard, his entire body shaking. They had made it. Against every odd, against everything the flood had thrown at them, they had made it to the tree. They sat on the branch, huddled together, the rain still falling, but feeling less threatening now that they were off the ground. Tyler was in the middle, holding Buddy close, the puppy wrapped in both his shirt and Mike's jacket. Shadow pressed against the boy from one side, Mike from the other, all of them sharing warmth, all of them just trying to stay conscious a little longer. Buddy stirred in Tyler's arms, a tiny movement that made the boy gasp with relief. The puppy opened his eyes, just a little, and made a soft sound that was almost a whimper. His little tail moved, barely visible, but it moved. Tyler started crying again, but these were tears of joy, tears of disbelief that his best friend was still alive. Mike's phone rang in his pocket, making them all jump. He pulled it out, seeing an unknown number, and answered with a voice so hoarse he barely recognized it. It was the Coast Guard. They had spotted them in the tree. The helicopter couldn't extract them because of the wind and the tree branches, but they had a boat crew 3 minutes out. 3 minutes. Just hold on for 3 more minutes. Mike looked at the water. It had stopped rising. In fact, it looked like it might be going down just slightly, just enough to notice. The worst of the flood had passed, the river starting to recede, returning to its banks. They had outlasted it. They had survived. Shadow's head suddenly lifted, his ears pricking forward. Mike heard it too, an engine. Coming from upstream, fighting the current, the sound growing louder. Then he saw it. A Coast Guard rescue boat, orange and white, cutting through the water with powerful determination. 3 figures in the boat, all in rescue gear, all focused on the tree where 4 survivors waited. Tyler saw the boat and started waving with one hand, his other arm still wrapped around Buddy. Shadow barked, loud and strong, his tail wagging for the first time since this whole nightmare began. Mike just sat there, watching the boat approach, feeling emotions he couldn't name and couldn't control wash through him. The rescue was efficient and professional. They brought the boat as close as they could. Then one of the crew, a young woman with kind eyes, climbed into the tree and reached for Tyler first. The boy hesitated, looking at Buddy, afraid they would make him let go of the puppy. But the rescuer smiled and promised that Buddy would come too, that they would all go together. Tyler let himself be passed down to the boat, Buddy still in his arms. Shadow went next, accepting the help with dignity, allowing himself to be guided into the boat, where he immediately went to Tyler, positioning himself protectively beside the boy and puppy. Then it was Mike's turn. He tried to climb down on his own, but his body finally gave out. Strong hands caught him, easing him into the boat, laying him down on the deck. The world started to blur. Mike heard voices, calm and professional, talking about hypothermia and shock and injuries. He heard Tyler asking if Buddy would be okay, heard one of the rescuers promising they had a vet standing by. He felt Shadow's nose nudge his hand, the dog checking on him even now, even after everything. Mike managed to move his fingers, scratching behind Shadow's ear, letting the dog know he was okay. As the boat pulled away from the tree, fighting back upstream toward safety, Mike looked back at the flood. The water was definitely receding now, the rain starting to ease. The worst was over. They had survived something that should have killed them. A 6-year-old boy, a 3-month-old puppy, a 10-year-old German shepherd, and a washed-up ex-cop with a dislocated shoulder. They reached shore, and suddenly there were more people, paramedics and firefighters and volunteers. Tyler was wrapped in blankets. Buddy was rushed to a waiting veterinary team. Shadow was checked over by a vet tech, who declared him exhausted, but miraculously uninjured. Mike's shoulder was popped back into place by a paramedic who apologized for the pain while Mike bit down on a piece of leather and tried not to scream. Later, at the hospital, after they had all been treated and warmed and fed, Mike found Tyler in the children's ward. The boy was sleeping, curled up under warm blankets, and on the bed next to him, also sleeping, was Buddy. The puppy was wrapped in bandages and had a 4-line in his tiny leg, but his chest was rising and falling steadily, and his little tail moved in his sleep like he was dreaming of better things. Shadow was lying on the floor next to the bed, still on guard duty even though the danger had passed. When Mike entered, the German shepherd's tail thumped once against the floor, acknowledging his partner, but the dog didn't move from his position protecting the boy and puppy. A nurse approached Mike, telling him that Tyler's mother had been found. She had survived, pulled from the water downstream, and was in the hospital 2 floors up. She would be reunited with her son in the morning. Buddy was going to make a full recovery. Shadow had been cleared by the vet and declared a hero. And Mike, despite his injuries and exhaustion, was going to be fine too. Mike sank into a chair, every muscle in his body screaming, his shoulder throbbing, his hands shaking with delayed shock. But as he watched Tyler sleep peacefully, Buddy dreaming beside him, Shadow keeping watch, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Peace, purpose, the knowledge that what he had done today mattered, that he had made a difference, that he had saved lives that deserved to be saved. Shadow looked up at him, those amber eyes meeting his, and Mike could swear the dog was smiling. They had done it. Together, they had faced something impossible and won. An old cop and his retired canine, one more time, one last time, proving that heroes don't retire. They just wait for the moment when they're needed most. Outside, the rain finally stopped. The sun broke through the clouds, painting the flooded landscape in gold. Tomorrow would bring the hard work of rebuilding, of recovering, of healing. But tonight, in this quiet hospital room, 4 survivors slept peacefully, knowing they had faced death together and come out the other side. And that was enough.